Good morning, everybody. By way of introduction, I'm Bruce Lawhorn. I work with the U.S. Federal Public Sector Program down in Herndon. I handle the intelligence programs. I want to welcome everybody to HLTCon. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend with us, learn about each other's problems, and work collaboratively with our developers, executives, and the team here in the federal sector. I've got the honor this morning of introducing the next speaker. Chris Biow, whom many of you know, is our next speaker and will be doing many of the introductions today. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He's worked at MongoDB. He was the federal CTO for MarkLogic. Today at Basis, he's the Senior Vice President for Public Sector globally. And so with that, Christopher, where are you? Ah, there you are, good.
Bruce, thank you very much for the introduction. What do I need to do to get my brief up? All right, I see scurrying in the back. I'll let the first screen come up. We're a bit surprised this year. We changed the framing of HLTCon, actually narrowed it a bit. And we're a bit surprised that we've got, judging by the registrations, more than 50% increase on last year. I would love to know why. So as you get a chance after, during the breaks and so on, please come up to me and let me know what brought you here today. Whatever, we'd certainly like to do more of it. I'm going to talk about information operations, but I'll start with a background of war. Information operations being war by other means. To me, this is the iconic example, the largest war we ever had, and the people who fought the most of it. I think everybody recognizes the nationality of that soldier. Anybody recognize the battle tanks behind him? Close. Was to have been the successor, yes. That may be, I was thinking KV-13, but it's in that class. To me, the most iconic, what a tank really should look like. Love this picture for its iconography. So moving from the battlefield, let's go to the information battlefield. We're going to talk here about information operations and specifically measuring the effects. If you can't measure it, it ain't science, right? And we're going to do this with sentiment analysis. So can anybody name this main battle tank? That's the infamous Biow, right? This is the field of information operations. We're going to move from the battlefield to something that's actually quite complementary, in some cases, by some definitions, combined or part of information operations, but where the text is the primary means. So there have been a number of words used, names given to what we call information operations. Probably the one we're most familiar with in English that civilians would use every day is propaganda. That's a fairly recent term, at least by the standards of Latin, going back only to the 1600s. Literally, this just means congregation, to propagate the faith. But anybody here take Latin in school? What can you make of propaganda as Latin? It wasn't English yet. What part of speech is that? It's a noun. But classical Latin had propagare, it's a verb. When you make a noun out of a verb like that, what type of noun is it? Well, this is an instance of, as odd as it sounds, modern Latin. It's a gerund. One of the terms we use the most, particularly because they've been directed against us, is active measures. Fairly literal translation of a Russian term of art that originated about a century ago, but reflects something that Russians have been doing for many centuries. And as we'll get to, they're good at it. A work of about this period, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a work of blood libel, still has ringing effect around the world a century after it was written. US, mostly in military context, you'll hear PSYOP. The operators who do it refer to it generally as PSYOPs. Divided into white, overt, truthful, gray, generally truthful, but not necessarily overtly attributed, and black, which can be outright deception or propagation of falsehoods. And then most recently, we have the acronym MISO. You'll see this come up a little bit later. By any name, this is information operations. There we go. And it can cover a very broad spectrum. Start with classical PSYOPs, deception, military in the battlefield, propaganda leaflets. Include, though, more within, since mass media has existed, state-controlled media. That original Vatican office could be considered state-controlled media. Anybody name some state-controlled media that the Russians have? RT. Sputnik. How about state-controlled media that the United States has? We'll get to it. It can use outright falsehoods, deep fakes. For example, the rumor that Saakashvili was Armenian. Apparently that's a vile insult in former Soviet Georgia. I don't quite understand why. Had a serious impact on his campaign. It can also be overt. Russia spent maxing out at about $50 million a year, at least total of at least $150 million, on US PR firms overtly pushing their propaganda. 2015, one of the largest firms that they used, Ketchum, to whom most of the money went, finally essentially fired them as a client. But that's a perfectly legitimate form of information operations. Most familiar to us are the mass media campaigns, what the St. Petersburg troll factory has been able to do to us. And it can even extend, I would argue, into offensive network operations. You can certainly hack someone's computer, post on their behalf, the full gamut of what can be done in cyber ops. But what about kinetic operations? I had ruled them out. I was giving an earlier version of this talk at ISS World a few months ago, and afterwards, a Royal Australian Navy officer came up to me, shook my hand, he'd palmed the challenge coin, for which I'm most grateful, and said, I'm pretty sure we define it rather more broadly. Let me go look it up and get back to you. This is what he came out with. And if you notice, I've lightly changed the color of what to me stands out in this entire definition: lethal information operations. I don't know that I agree with this definition, but as far as the Australians are concerned, it's a continuum. And as you go through this, talking about impacting the decision-making, the capability, the understanding of the audience, starts to get very much like something that that Clausewitz would have written if he had been on Twitter. This is going to the will of the enemy, and it doesn't matter by this definition if it happens to be an information packet in the form of a 500-pound bomb. Again, that's a little broader than I would define it, but worthy of note that there is not a clear edge on the definition. So let's go to that most classical form of information operations that we're most familiar with, the troll at the keyboard. And in this case, I'm going to talk about the United States as targets, something we've become acutely aware of the last 3 years. I'm just going to take one anecdotal example because I'm going to come back to this question of measurability. This is from former FBI agent Clint Watts. He's now with GW University, I believe, testifying before the Senate about a specific information operation, which is significant because it was detectable and traceable by us. And I'm going to contrast what we can measure versus what our opponents, our threats can measure, who are actually conducting offensive operations against us. So in this case, he was able to monitor and detect that those two press organs, Sputnik and RT, put up stories hyping what had been a rather minor demonstration by, I think, around 100 people in Incirlik Air Force Base in Turkey, and turning it into a virtual terrorist overrun of the base and potential capture of nuclear weapons that we purportedly have at the base. It was a false story. It was then, after Sputnik and RT put it up, it was promoted heavily by the troll factory in St. Petersburg until the story was rolling, and in about 24 hours, they basically went hands off. How do you measure the effect of that? 2 weeks later, Paul Manafort casually mentions that a NATO base in Turkey was under attack by terrorists. So, classic case where false news is implanted, it's gotten rolling in the blogosphere, and I don't know exactly what the sequence of events were, but bottom line, you can measure the fact that this false meme was implanted in the mind of an influential US politician. He earned a pants on fire for it. I don't actually think he was lying. I think he probably thought it was true. But you want measurable information operations? There it is. Question is, though, what impact did that have? If, as assessed by the US intelligence community, the goal of the Russian information operations was to get a certain person elected, what effect did that have on the overall election process? I can't come up with a logical effect. If anything, it slightly discredited that side. I have no ability to measure what the effect would have been on the actual decision-making process of the American public. So although this is measurable in the sense of being able to testify before the Senate, anybody can go confirm Clint Watt's results. Its effect in terms of the mission, I don't know. All right, this is state-controlled media. What state? Voice of America. This is US state-controlled media. They have a great deal of editorial independence, but this was just a few weeks ago. They quoted a variety of sources, including Clint Watt's, about a particular target that the Russians have had, specifically US military personnel and primarily enlisted troops. This has become a key worry to the Department of Defense, that Russia can predispose them to certain choices, influencing your adversary's decisions. Bingo, we hit one of the key attributes of information operations, and actually having a base of support among US military enlisted. I'm a former Navy guy, flew backseat F-14s. This scares me. But how do you measure it? That's got to be key. If Vladimir Putin is putting in the kind of money we can easily measure his money, the $150 million that went overtly and had foreign contact forms officially filed by US public relations agencies, we know that it's billions when you count the size of his St. Petersburg troll factory. On days they've been able to deploy, for a single day, over 10,000 actual humans, augmented by an infinite number of bots. It's billions and billions of rubles. Vladimir Putin isn't spending, the Duma isn't authorizing that kind of money unless they have good metrics. So here we come back to classical intelligence stagecraft. In the Navy, we would often, the first information we would get about some new weapon system of an adversary would be an image of the crate. Well, what do you do in the intelligence community when you have an image of a crate? You call out the cratologists. And they measure the crate, they look at how it's constructed, where the center of gravity should be, all those sorts of things. And then you hand over that gross description of what would probably be inside the crate to the technologists, and the rocket people say, okay, given the technology we assess that this particular adversary has, here's the rocket fuel they would use, here are the dimensions of the booster, somebody else does the airframe, the radar people come in, and when you're all done, you are making a technological assessment based upon reasonable assumptions of what your opponent has, of what's inside that crate. So I'm doing this with Russian information operations. What, if Vladimir Putin is putting in billions, he wouldn't do it without measuring, how would he measure it? Let me let that hang for a minute, I'll get to it, because I want to look at the other side of things. What I will put out right now is one more measure that starts to get to effect and that's easy, that doesn't require anything like AI. And that's simple hashtags. There are specific hashtags that were launched by the St. Petersburg troll farm. #Hillary is two-faced happens to be one of them. They came up with it. It had a certain play. They love to take both sides of an issue. Right here, you're looking at, if I specifically tried to track Boycott NFL. This was Brand 24, one of the commercial organizations that offers these tracking services. Boycott NFL, I'm just looking at its profile over November. But if you look at the bottom, there's actually someone tweeting not only Boycott NFL, but also Stand with Kaepernick. Both of these were originated by the St. Petersburg troll factory. They're happy to take both sides of an issue. And here we have one person, don't know if he's a St. Petersburg troll or not, who seems to be taking both sides of the issue himself all at once. So this at least is trackable and starts to get us toward the answer. If my troll factory puts out a hashtag and I can monitor minute by minute what the effect of that hashtag is, I have something more measurable than the anecdotal examples like Paul Manafort had a meme implanted in his mind. All right, let's go to our operators. Most of these people are actually with SOCOM. Some of them elsewhere, particularly the US Army, has a large group that does that. But this isn't the guys who wear ghillie suits and give each other hand signals. This is US information operations. We do them too. We actually do very little of them, which I'll get to in a moment. But let's take a look at that. What website is this? I can read the Latin script. I have no Arabic. I can see this is diaruna.com. If I look to the right, I can see the Latin script also in the logo. Who here has decent Arabic, can read it? Any characterization you'd like to give to this website just based, or in fact, let me scroll down and we'll, I'm sorry, go back. Well, I probably gave it away to everybody there, but how would you characterize it? Just looks like news? Is that fair enough? All right, I'm going to use Google Translate because I don't read Arabic. And it does look like a news site. As we scroll down, the news tends to be the sort that would reinforce the US side of things. And the site is overt. We click on who we are, and we get this. Back to anybody who can read Arabic. Who is this? Who's right here in the first line? Anybody?
Supported by US forces?
Yes. It's CENTCOM, overtly. Overtly, CENTCOM has a couple of websites. They offer several languages, and they actually cultivate jihadist discussions in their forums. I'm sure there's some limit at which they would cut it off if it came down to specific acts of violence or whatever. But where would you rather the jihadists argue with each other over your news so that you can measure the impact of your information operations? Would you rather it be on the dark web or on a CENTCOM-controlled website? Pick one. So we do this. What is unfortunate is we do very little of this. CENTCOM has a couple of websites. The US PSYOPs or MISO operations have been all but shut down relative to where they were 20 years ago. There was a belief, I've heard attributed to Donald Rumsfeld, I've never found an authoritative source for it, that connectedness and the internet and the web would kill the effectiveness of propaganda. I mean, how hard can it be? You read something that might be propaganda, you look on your device and you find out if it's true or not. Propaganda's over, right? Seems to have gone the other way, but the effect of funding, whether that quote is true or apocryphal, has been real. Our funding has been cut, and if you look particularly at Roger Smith, his real name, testimony to the US Senate since 2013, he's the main promoter at SOCOM of PSYOPs, it's been cut severely. And the reason it's been cut, if you look at the comments from the congressman and the legislation about what little has been allotted, has been difficulty with measures of effectiveness. We have unilaterally disarmed in information operations due to a lack of measures of effectiveness. This is as key as you can get to an asymmetric disadvantage we brought upon ourselves against probably the best practitioners, but it's not just the Russians, especially after the impact they've had in 2016. It's going to be everybody. It's certainly the Chinese, it's the Iranians, it's the North Koreans, and it's going to be, as in anything else in intelligence, our allies too. We're going to need to up our game. So how do we go about this? We need to get past hashtags or anecdotal examples of campaign managers saying something that ain't so. This is where we get to AI and specifically sentiment analysis. So let's take a sentimental declaration that's classic sentiment analysis. I love Coke, would drink it all day, but no matter how much I try it, I dislike Pepsi's flavor. This happens to be the truth from myself. We submit that in JSON here to our endpoint for sentiment analysis. And we get back a document level analysis that says it's positive, but in an confidence. How useful is that? Okay, let's look at the rest of the response. Oh, we also have mention or attribute or entity level sentiment. Now, this is what we're looking for. Pepsi comes back with a negative. I said I dislike it. And it's at a 0.66 level of confidence. And note, we've also linked Pepsi to an authoritative entity ID. That goes back to Wikidata, which goes to Wikipedia. We've now actually linked that to something in the real world. That's useful. Coke. I said I love Coke, so we have an even higher confidence. That's a stronger word than dislike. It's probably the reason that the entire document analysis came out positive. And in this case, I've got an entity ID that's a temporary. It'll be resolved to any other instances of this entity in the same document, but we were unable to resolve it to an authoritative source. And this is because this is only linking. It's not entity resolution that's provided by this endpoint today. But stay tuned. What we want, I'm digressing a little bit here, is the ability to take Coke, which is not quite the exact rendering of the formal entity, Coca-Cola, map the two, and give an entity ID to it. I'll just say this is coming. If this is the type of capability that interests or excites you, please talk to us, or we'll talk about a session we're going to have tomorrow, more of a user conference-oriented session where we're going to show some of this capability. All right, back to the main program. What did we just analyze here? What did we say? We said whether at the document or the entity level, whether something was positive or negative. And that's what we have off the shelf today. What, absent any other particular goal, sentiment analysis generally measures. How do we do that? It's all about the data. We're going to have a lot on data and annotation later today. We are as much a data company as we are a software company. So we get a corpus. We have humans annotate it. We train off of that corpus. We then test our results. And then we can start iterating. I think we may not get to this until tomorrow, but techniques such as active learning can make this a continuous agile process rather than a waterfall sequence. But that's the bottom line. That's how you do pretty much anything in NLP, sentiment most of all. All right, so that's how you do sentiment, but do I care whether people are positive or negative if I'm a military information operator? Not exactly. I'm interested in sentiment, but specific to information operations. So let's go to CENTCOM. What is the mission of CENTCOM? It's actually quite explicit. This is a direct quote. Their military information support operations, their information operations, support communications targeted to these mission goals of CENTCOM. Decrease support for violent organizations, reduce terrorist recruitment, increase force protection, increase cooperation and interoperability. Those are military missions. Those are what, as a MISO operator, I am supposed to influence because that's my job if I'm working for CENTCOM. That's their mission. So let's just take decreased support for violent extremist organizations. How would we do sentiment analysis for that? Pretty much what we just said. Take a corpus, annotate it, train, test, iterate in an agile fashion with active learning. And I'll throw one more thing up here, which is transfer learning. I'm not going to go into details on this, but this gives us a better ability to bridge, particularly among languages. All right, I'm going to wind up with an anti-pattern, a caution. Clearly, we need, as a country, to up our game in information operations. That's going to happen. You're going to see in the next Congress hearings on the Hill, and I will predict now that you're going to see funding going to address this gap we have. When you unilaterally disarm, your opponent gets an asymmetric advantage, and of course they attack you with it. Can we respond to the St. Petersburg troll factory with nukes? Probably not. If we can respond in kind, best defense is a good offense. Now we're in a position to actually control it. So expect that. I am going to talk, though, last thing, about an anti-pattern. There is a temptation to say, well, why don't we just use translation? Why don't we take all these languages that are difficult to deal with, where we maybe have difficulty getting text, we certainly have difficulty getting annotators or cleared people, and we'll just translate away all our problems into English. This is an example that we like to use of where that causes problems for text analysis. Why text analytics needs to be done in the original language. I was browsing through Al Jazeera. As noted, I don't read Arabic, so I'm flipping back and forth translating with Google Translate, and I get this image with a caption, "Battle of Tenderness." What happened? Exactly. Well, but what does Raqqa mean? What does Philadelphia mean? Brotherly love. So it's a perfectly legitimate translation from a word-by-word, context-free standpoint. Just the proper noun is all wrong. And once you have gotten this loss in translation, you're never going to get back. You start trying to do text analytics now on the English text that's returned, and by the way, Bing, at least at this time, had exactly the same problem. You're never going to get it back. Whereas, run it through text analytics, we don't do translation. We only do one thing with respect to transliteration, really, but we do that very well. We recognize correctly this is a location, and we correctly translate, or in this case, transliterate, it's a mix of the two, to Al Raqqa.